Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Ludes. I am the Executive Director of the Pell Center here at Salve Regina University and Vice President for Public Research and Initiatives at the university. It is a real pleasure to be with everybody tonight. We've got an event that we've been looking forward to, since the spring when we thought that Professor Dallek was going to be able to join us for the McGinty lecture last April. The pandemic had something to say about that, but he's been gracious enough to join us here tonight, and we're thrilled that he's able to do so. We hope that with vaccines and face masks and other measures, we might be able to get Professor Dallek up to the university sometime in the not too distant future. But for now, we are thrilled that he's able to join us tonight. He's a man who doesn't need much introduction. You also all got his biography via email before the event. But as you know, he is one of the most acclaimed presidential historians of the last 40 years. His work on Roosevelt, on Kennedy, and on many other presidents stands the test of time. His new book is How Did We Get Here? I can tell you that this is a wonderful read of the evolution of the American presidency from Teddy Roosevelt to Donald Trump, and it answers a lot of questions. We're going to get into some of those tonight. I'm joined on the panel tonight with my great colleague from the history department, Dr. Bill Leeman, who's going to be helping me with some of the questioning. But we're also joined with a member of the McGinty family. And I just want to take a moment to recognize all the people who helped make this event possible. It is really a testament to the partnership between the Department of History here at Salve Regina University, the Pell Center, and the Office of University Relations. But truthfully, this event is really the fruit of the generosity of the McGinty family, who established the John E. McGinty Fund in history to honor our former university trustee and parent, whose son, also named John, graduated from Salve in 2001. Mr. McGinty was a senior advisor in the investment banking division of UBS Financial Services and a managing director of Credit Suisse. Professionally, he specialized in the financial analysis of the engineering construction industry, but personally, he was passionate about the study of history. The McGinty family's generosity honors and enshrines that enthusiasm for understanding who we are by understanding our past. As a university and as a community, we are grateful for their support of events like tonight, which celebrate scholars and scholarship and enrich our understanding. So now it's my distinct pleasure to welcome another lover of history, Bill McGinty, to offer a welcome from the family and to get us started with tonight's question. Bill.
Great, thanks, Jim. Well, Professor Dallek, it is absolutely such a privilege and an honor to be here. As all of us are trapped in the last 8 months of pandemic isolation, it's really great to have these sort of great moments. My father would absolutely love to have been here. He would really love to pick your brain, and I'll do my best in his stead. But I think we're all here to hear from you. So let's get right to it. I think my question, and I've told everyone I'm gonna have to jump off pretty soon to take care of my small little kids running around upstairs, is, you know, historically, there's a lot of great perspective in your book about exactly, as the title said, how we get here. What are some sort of historical precedents that actually people aren't really aware of? And I guess my question is a little bit forward thinking, if you don't mind. And it's basically, in your view, do you see any path back towards a less polarized electorate, towards a less polarized population? You know, in the last 15, 20 years, I think the American people have become far more entrenched in their views, far less open to discourse, to discussion. And I think that's been reflected in politics, especially in the last 8 years or so. And I'm wondering, from a historical perspective, do you see a path away from polarization in the next couple of decades? And I will mute and please take over.
Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. And thanks to your family for being so supportive of the university and historical studies. You know, the answer to your question for me is that I'm an optimist. And the country has been through trying times before with bitter struggles and divisions in the 1920s, of course. Before that, the awful Civil War of the 1860s. And yet, I think there is at bottom in this country a commitment to unity, to the idea that America represents something different in history from what has come before in politics around the world, going back to ancient times, and that there is the sense that we don't want to lose this. And however divided may be, and how much strife we may feel, at the end of the day, we want to find enough common ground. And after all, when you think about it, this is a country with such diverse regions and religions and ethnicities and variety of experience. And yet we've had this impulse to pull together and to be Americans, because it represents something sacred and holy that we don't want to lose. And after all, the country has enjoyed, for the most part, a degree of prosperity, which has given millions of people the opportunity to live a better life. And, you know, you mentioned your 3 children. I'm sure what in significant ways animates you and your wife is eager for a future that will allow your sons to enjoy their positions, however privileged they may be, to contribute to the society, to build successful lives. And I think these are bedrock features of our society. Now, I don't want to be Pollyannish and say it's not as if we don't have division and episodes of crime and violence. We do, but by and large, we remain a civil society that enjoys a degree of achievement and prosperity that is the envy of the world.
I want to just do a little quick air traffic control here before Bill Leeman asks his first questions. But folks, if you have questions that you want to ask yourself of Professor Dallek, you can use the comment function on Facebook. Just type your message there, and as the evening progresses, we'll grab those questions and ask them directly of Professor Dallek. So, Bill, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Jim. Professor Dallek, in exploring the question of how did we get here, you make the point in your book about President Trump being largely uninformed about American history and in particular the history of the American presidency. And that certainly fits, I think, with multiple reports from the media or even statements from President Trump's own staffers that indicate that he's not much of a reader, I guess we could say. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about which presidents have been the most mindful of history and the most interested in history, and how did that interest influence their presidency?
Well, that's a wonderful question. And of course, in the 20th century, you can begin with Theodore Roosevelt, who was, of course, a historian in his own right and had written some books before he became president in 1901. And Woodrow Wilson was also, of course, an academic who had taught at Princeton and was keenly interested in the history of the South and of Virginia in particular, where he had been born and grown up. And of course, Franklin Roosevelt, who had a keen interest in naval history and in the fact that he had a relative who had been president of the country before he ever ran for any office, which of course was for the governorship in the state of New York. And also I met Bill Clinton, and he had read a number of history books I could gather from my conversation with him. And there was a kind of aura to meeting him in the Oval Office and feeling the history around me, so to speak. And I had never been in the Oval Office before, nor had I had a direct connection to a president. And more recently, I had dinner 5 times with President Obama because he, of course, was an academic at the University of Chicago Law School. And he had 5 dinners, which I was lucky enough to participate in, with historians. And he wanted to talk to us about presidential history and, in a sense, how he had gotten to the Oval Office. And it was fascinating to have this kind of interaction with a sitting president. And so, of course, I was greatly puzzled by the fact that we ended up with a president who knew so little history. And to me, the most striking example was that when he was at Pearl Harbor, Donald Trump looked at the Arizona, the battleship that had been sunk and was now a monument to the memory of those events. And he didn't know what it was. He didn't know about Pearl Harbor. And I found that astonishing that a sitting president didn't know. After all, this is not ancient history. It goes back to December 1941. Now, he was a boy, you know, but still, I think any sitting president should know about Pearl Harbor and World War II.
Okay. One of the most important lessons I learned from you as one of your graduate students, and learned specifically in your course on the presidency, and it's something that I try to emphasize with my own students as well, is that historians need to wait, in a lot of cases, many years before trying to study and gain a real understanding of a presidential administration. It takes time for presidential libraries to open up. It takes time for presidential papers to be released to scholars. And it takes time to get perspective on an administration, to understand its legacy. So I understand why in your book, you focus really on the presidents from Theodore Roosevelt to Ronald Reagan. But I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the more recent presidencies of Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, and how you see them as serving as preludes to the rise of Donald Trump.
Well, yes, what motivated me to write this book was to try to understand why would the public put into the presidency someone who had never run for any office before and seemed to have no particular knowledge about public affairs or the presidential office, you see. And what made or makes Trump different is that he never ran for anything before. Now, that's true of some other earlier presidents. It was true of William Howard Taft, who had never run for anything until he ran for president in 1908. It was true of Herbert Hoover, who had never run, certainly for no national office, when he ran in 1928, and also for Dwight Eisenhower, 52. But the difference between them and Donald Trump is that they had served in public office. Taft had been Governor General of the Philippines, and he had been Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of War. Herbert Hoover had spent 8 years as the Secretary of Commerce in the 1920s. And of course, Dwight Eisenhower was entirely familiar with public office and governing because he had a long storied career in the US Army and in leadership in World War II. But what made Trump so different was that not only had he never run for anything before, which is something that I've just indicated others have shown us, but he was someone who had no feel for what this office was about and what public service really meant. And I found that strange. Now, I know that each election challenges the candidates to sort of present something fresh, something new. People love the idea. They don't like politics much. And so that translates into sort of negative feelings about politicians and presidential candidates as well. But as I just said, while you get some people like Herbert Hoover or Dwight Eisenhower who never ran for anything before, they had rich public careers serving in public office. I think, though, that what captured the imagination in the recent in the 2016 was the fact that Trump really was different. He was new. He was a successful businessman, or so he presented himself that way. And you think about the word new. Theodore Roosevelt called his administration the new nationalism. Woodrow Wilson said it was the new freedom. Roosevelt, the New Deal. Kennedy, the new frontier. And if they didn't say new, it was something beyond what we had before when Lyndon Johnson said his was the great society. Now, Richard Goodwin, his advisor, suggested he call his administration the good society. And he said, no, I want this to be the great society. And so this was going to be different. This was going to go beyond what we had seen before. So I understand the impulse to have something new. And also, I think in that last election in 2016, Hillary Clinton was sort of old news. The Clintons had been in the public eye for quite a while, and there was a kind of Clinton fatigue, I believe. And so the appeal of having a Donald Trump, despite what little experience he had in public affairs, was commanding. Now, what I would say, without being a prophet or meant to be seen as a prophet, in 1908, William Howard Taft, who, again, like these others, had never run for anything before, but he had a career that had put him in public affairs. However, his administration was seen as so lacking in appeal and accomplishment that when he tried to run for a second term in 1912, he had the misfortune to be up against Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, who of course won that election, and Taft got only about 8% of the popular vote. It's staggering that a president should plunge to such a low number. There were no public opinion polls most days, of course, but that's the one popular number we can find about Taft. So I think people want something new, but at the same time, they're keen to sustain our traditions. And so when people are familiar who run in some of these elections, if the country has been through some kind of a division and turmoil and uncertainty, it wants someone who represents continuity with the past. And so, however much they may be described as new or different or innovative, it's their connection to the past that also serves them so well. So, you know, it's nothing that's all that simple. It really is a combination of new and forward-looking and continuity with the past.
Professor Dallek, I'm wondering if you can maybe share some thoughts generally about the value of studying history, and in particular political history, at a time when so much of the field seems to be moving towards social and cultural history rather than the field that you've made your career in.
Well, you're absolutely right in the sense, Jim, that as I was a professor at the University of California in Los Angeles, I saw the ground moving beneath my feet. And when I studied for my doctorate at Columbia, the interest in the profession was much about politics, presidents, and foreign affairs, diplomatic history. And it was moving away in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, 80s to the new social history. Now, I'm delighted that we've expanded historical studies so that we think about and write about African American history and women's history, Chicano history. But as the saying goes, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That, you know, political history remains a vital element of our national culture. And I think it needs to be sustained. But, you know, things are dynamic. And in the study of history, it's also dynamic. You go from one kind of focus to another. And what I keep saying is, I wish I could come back in 100 years to see what's being studied and what the focus of historical study has become. And I'm sure I'd be somewhat surprised, although I'd be delighted if people were still reading my books.
I suspect they will be. I want to remind folks that if they'd have questions, and we've gotten some already, but if you have questions that you want to ask of Professor Dallek, make sure you add them to the comment section on Facebook Live, and we'll be happy to respond and share them with Professor Dallek. Before we start that, though, I want to ask you another question. There are probably for the first time in my adult life, very serious, credible people who have expressed concern and alarm about the future of our republic. And I'm wondering where you fall on that question.
Well, you know, I am concerned. And the other night at this first debate, it was unnerving because there should be a regard for the institution of the presidency so that the sitting president does not speak and act in ways that diminish what people think of the highest office, elective office in our land. And I think, frankly, Donald Trump hurt his chances for re-election by being so combative and I don't know quite what to call it, but it just is not presidential to do that. And I think people want to see a president who has a kind of regard for the office and respect for the institution, that you don't, so to speak. I remember Eisenhower would say about Joseph McCarthy, I will not get into the gutter with that man, because he felt that to get into some kind of arm wrestling or combat with McCarthy was to diminish the office of the president. And so he was a man who had a very positive sense of what conservatism meant. And that's, I think, important, because we need to hang on to the best that we've achieved and developed in our history, and not to go off the rails, so to speak. And I think we will, and I am optimistic, and I'm hopeful we're going to come back to this in a way that will recreate a fresh feeling of confidence in and regard for the office.
Well, let's turn to some of the questions that folks have posted. I know Bill and I have talked. We could talk to you for about 4 days, but we will respect the interest from folks in the audience. And let's start actually with Sally McGinty, again, one of the McGinty family, who is one of the great benefactors of the university and the supporters of this event. She asks, the debate made me wonder if the media thinks Fight Club behavior sells. If Biden wins, will they eviscerate him too, just because they've decided it's fun and it sells papers?
Well, there is, of course, an ugly element of that kind, and that these folks are in business not to be ignored, but to be watched, attended to, you see. And I think that whoever runs for public office, if you have regard for the country's institutions, you're walking on a high wire, because you want attention, you want people to hear you, to listen to you, but you don't want to cross the lines and do it by being so crude or vulgar or combative that we're different from these countries where you have bloodshed over politics so often, and we need to sustain that tradition. And so I was offended by this debate earlier this week, and particularly by what President Trump did, because he should be more mindful and show greater regard for the office he's serving. And frankly, I think it hurt his re-election campaign, because at bottom, I think the great bulk of people in this country have a kind of regard for. I know, myself, when I got into that Oval Office to meet Donald Trump, to meet Bill Clinton, I was thrilled to be in that office where there was a kind of aura of earlier presidents I had read and studied about and written about, and it's really a sacred institution to me. And it's sort of like when I taught at Oxford in England for a year, and there is a kind of regard for history and for their institutions. And that college I taught in Oxford went back 600 years. And now we're not that old. And I'm not saying we need 600 years to reach that point, but we do have traditions now. We are a society that goes back over 200 years, and that there should be regard and sensitivity to what our traditions mean.
We've got more questions in the queue here, so I'm just going to keep going right through them. Our former colleague at the university, Bill Issel, asks, what is your view of the use of social media, such as Twitter, by a sitting president? Do you see this as facilitating democratic discourse? Do you agree with critics who regard this as a threat to genuine democratic discourse?
Well, I think it's both. That presidents need to master the current media. Franklin Roosevelt was brilliant at that with his radio fireside chats. And he pioneered the use of radio in ways that were dignified and attentive to how the public would respond. And and I have my doubts about some of these new facilities for expression, but there's no stopping them because this is the age we live in. And so therefore, I think what it takes is a really smart, effective politician who knows about our history, but is modern enough to turn these sources of communication into a constructive manner or in a constructive direction. And so this is what I look for in a politician, because people don't like, as I said before, politics or politicians, and that's okay because they don't trust them. They see them as telling lots of lies and as very self-serving, and of course, in a number of instances, corrupt and eager to sort of exploit their power or position by feeding at the public trough. And but we go through these periods where there is, as with that Warren G. Harding administration, 1921 to 23, and then the counter to that was Calvin Coolidge, who was seen as a Puritan soul from Massachusetts, you see, and Herbert Hoover, who was also seen as a very upright citizen. So there is a dual tradition in this country, and we're going to be struggling with this forever. I don't think it's going to go away. And therefore, what we need now in the future is someone who masters these new forms of communication, but in the most constructive way possible, the way Franklin Roosevelt did.
So Evan, who is a student at Salve, notes that he's currently writing his senior thesis on Andrew Jackson and the Bank War. With his research, he says, I have found similarities between Jackson and Trump, especially in regards to their populist rhetoric. Are these two presidents outliers in terms of their populist stance, or are there examples of those who have analogous approaches to the presidency?
I think that every successful president has had elements of using populist rhetoric and of reaching out. But, the important thing here is the degree to which you are able to use this, and to use that kind of rhetoric in a way that shows you respectful of differences in the society, and the need for continuity with the past and for the need for unity, but at the same time being savvy enough to show that they have an affinity for what is fresh and that they're willing to affirm it. So again, you know, it's an art. Nobody can teach somebody how to be a great politician, I believe. Nobody could teach somebody how to be an effective president. I think there's something in your mind, in your outlook of the world, and occasionally we get someone who is very good at that and effective, and of course they incorporate a certain amount of populist rhetoric. Now, at the end of the day, Andrew Jackson was much more that way than I think Donald Trump has been. And so it's, as I say again, there's artistry to this, which nobody can teach you how to do it.
Got another question here from Dimitri, who says that it raises a question about the role of Congress as a check and a balance against the president. And I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here, but how can Congress be forced to start doing their jobs of legislating and keeping the executive accountable, and not simply being reduced to rank punditry?
Yes, it's an excellent question, and it is the challenge that every effective president faces. How do you deal with Congress? After all, you have 535 people now in the House and the Senate that you're going to have a relationship with. And at the same time, people in the House and the Senate are going to deal with the president, only men so far, but it won't be long. We'll see a woman as president, I'm confident. And how they deal with each other is, of course, settles in history as an example of excellence, of effectiveness, or failure. And currently, we have Nancy Pelosi in the House, and she, of course, is, I think, a very skillful leader. And the question is, will someone emerge in the Senate who comes across as equally skillful in using the office of Congress or the president, rather the Senate, to emerge? You know, it's become very different because remember, in the 19th century, and particularly after the Civil War, it was leaders in the Congress who were much more dominant in reaching public opinion, in shaping public thinking than the presidents. Most of those presidents after Lincoln, except maybe for Grant, came across as very similar guys with big beards and unmemorable rhetoric, and the presidency sunk into a kind of low point. And Theodore Roosevelt, of course, reversed that because he was someone who was so much more dynamic. And then Woodrow Wilson followed him, and Wilson in particular was a masterful speech maker. He was not very good, apparently, at one-on-one communication and relationships, but when he got before a larger audience or Congress, he had a kind of magical power that elevated him to 2 terms in the presidency.
We've got a question here from John, who asks whether or not you believe the issues that have been raised about Vice President Biden's son Hunter's relationship with the Ukrainian energy firm Burisma is a valid issue in the 2020 election.
You know, my feeling is that, and it happens all the time, that family members come under scrutiny. Remember Bill Clinton's relatives and Franklin Roosevelt's children were anything but ideal national figures. They were something of an embarrassment to him. Harry Truman blew his stack over the nasty things that were said about his daughter and her singing. And but generally, I think children and relatives of these presidents should be left out of the picture. Now, of course, first ladies can't be. And Eleanor Roosevelt set a mark that every first lady would strive to achieve and live up to, you see. And they're in the White House, and they are part of the current presidential family, you see. But it's better to not look at a brother, a sister, the children. You know, they didn't run for office, and I think they should be sort of out of bounds and put aside.
I'm going to remind folks that if you've got comments or questions that you'd like to share, please post them in the comment function on Facebook Live. We've got about 10 minutes left, and we'll try to get to as many of these as we can. Elaine asks, have there been any presidential transitions that have been problematic or concerning? I suppose the related question is, are you concerned about the prospect for a peaceful transition of power after Election Day this year, should Vice President Biden win the election?
Yes, I am. Indeed, this is something that is front and center with lots of people. The very fact that this is a question being asked is unusual, because generally both candidates are respectful of what the country's tradition is, that we're not, dare I say it, a Latin American society, which is going to see upheaval and revolution. But Donald Trump has agitated the question that was just asked. And I find it right on the mark to ask that question, and disturbing that it has to be asked, because our sacred tradition in this country is that whoever wins the presidency, be it the incumbent or be it the challenger, we honor that, because this is democracy. This is the way it's supposed to work. Now, of course, it's not as simple as that, in that there have several times been elections that have been so close and difficult to identify the decisive winner, that it puts that tradition in some doubt. So I hope whoever wins this current election wins it by a wide margin, because the wider the margin, the more difficult it becomes for the loser to then challenge our tradition of peaceful transfer of power.
We've got a question here from, I lost the beat here, from Sean. I think it's sort of a similar question about sort of where we are right now, but your thoughts on the issues and concerns that have been raised with mail-in ballots. And I think the broader question is about voter fraud.
Yeah, well, of course, there's been voter fraud in our history, and there have been boss-run politics in places like Chicago, in West Virginia, and all over the country. But by and large, people have faith in our electoral system, that the people who win the elections gain access to power. And it's vital that we maintain this if we're going to sustain our democracy. And so it will be unnerving and troubling the way this debate was this week, when it was so combative and unseemly for a president to speak and perform the way he did. Presidents who show a sense of humor are so much better. The first debate between Richard Nixon and John Kennedy in September 1960, people don't remember afterwards what the topics were or what they were debating. What they do remember is that Kennedy looked more presidential, and that he, instead of debating Nixon and going back and forth with him in a kind of nasty conflict, Kennedy looked into the television cameras and spoke to the American people. Now, I was impressed with the fact that in this debate this week, that Biden tried to do that. And I think he knew that from the Kennedy experience. And I hope he took it from my biography of Kennedy, because I met Biden once. He had just read my Kennedy biography, and he was very enthusiastic about it. So I don't know. I'm just patting myself on the back.
That's a great story. And we know that Vice President Biden is a great admirer of the Kennedys. Ann Page, got a couple more questions here, but Ann Page asks about your research methods and whether or not you have found whether or not you continue to find presidential libraries to be fruitful places to conduct research.
Yes, they are really a wonderful addition to historical scholarship and studies. And I've worked at a number of these libraries, at the FDR Library, the Truman Library, the Kennedy Library, the Johnson Library. I've also had a little experience at the Eisenhower Library and the Herbert Hoover Library. So I'm a great fan of these libraries and of the archivists and people who serve there in sorting these papers, because, the materials are so abundant now. Nobody can go through all those papers. There are millions of pages of documents. So it's really a great tradition, I think, of doing scholarship that takes you, because these libraries also give you a feel for what that presidency was about. And I think it's invaluable to get to that library. I know I felt that way about the FDR Library and the Kennedy and the Johnson libraries. Those are the three in which I spent the greatest amount of time. And of course, what changes now is that so much of these materials are online. And so while I'm happy to read documents online and save myself trips to presidential libraries, but I'm glad that I've had the experience of sitting in the reading rooms of these presidential libraries and the Harry Truman Library as well, and had the sense and the feel. They don't give you the original documents. They have copies of them, but still, and occasionally an original document slips in. And I've seen this, and I instantly tell the archivist, this is an original copy. Don't let me play with it or handle it, because I think it's like a sacred text that needs to be preserved.
We've got a question here from our university president, Kelly Armstrong, who notes that the next week we'll have the debate between the vice presidential candidates, Vice President Mike Pence and Senator Kamala Harris. And she asks your thoughts on what role can we expect the vice presidential candidates to play in this election?
Well, I think it's traditional that the vice presidential if he's a sitting vice president who has been elected with, of course, they're not elected on their own. They sort of come along on the ticket, and that they're going to defend the president. You know, that's their job, and the challenger is going to. So, you know, it's going to be an extension of the presidential debate. It's really another format of that, because they're not running themselves, but they can do some good for their candidate at the top of the ticket if they are more effective than their vice presidential opponent. But of course, what makes this debate interesting is that we will have the first African-American woman in history to be running for vice president of the United States. So we can only imagine what will happen in the future as to who the candidates will be and how they will line up. And it's a wonderful demonstration of the growth, expansion of our democracy, because there are other people who need to get in the mix. And as I said before, I'm sure we're going to end up having a woman president in the not too distant future. After all, in Europe, you've seen a number of women who have achieved the highest political office. And in Israel, you've seen that happen. And it's just makes sense. You know, it's 100 years since women have gotten the right to vote. So why not now have a woman as president or vice president?
So we've got time for just one more question. And Professor Dallek, I'm just going to note that your camera seems to have shifted just a little bit. And so I don't know if you can reset that, we can get your full face back in the frame. But I'm going to give the last question here to Bill Leeman. And I'm just regretting that I didn't get the chance to ask, you know, how was Bill actually as a student? But we'll save that for another time. But Professor Leeman, if you would like to bring us home.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Professor Dallek, the last question I have really kind of combines a couple of the questions that we received from the audience, but it involves research on a presidential administration. And I can say one of my fondest memories of graduate school was a day I went out to the Kennedy Library to work on research for my paper on Kennedy and the space program for your research seminar. And you were the only other person in the reading room that day. And I kind of had one of those magical moments where I'm like, I'm in the Kennedy Library and Robert Dallek is the only other person in the library with me. And I remember they had me fill out a form, a reader's form, and I had to write who my advisor was for the research I was doing. And I said you, because it was for your class. And it was the best service I've ever received at any library. So. But the question I have sort of goes back to my colleague Bill Issel's question about President Trump's use of Twitter, but also the question that was asked about your own research methods and all the hours you've spent in presidential libraries. And I guess my question is, what do you think research is going to look like for future presidential historians trying to study the Trump administration 20, 30 years down the road and beyond?
Well, I doubt that they're going to be sitting in any library. My guess is And it's already come to pass with the Barack Obama materials, because I think they've been putting those online. And I don't think that the Barack Obama Presidential Library is even open to researchers at this point, you see. The Bill Clinton materials are, but even those, people will want to do it online. It will save them travel expenses, getting to a library, because justifiably, these libraries are always in the home state or hometown of the president, you see. And so, you know, it's a big country, and I know I was dependent on all sorts of grants over the years so that I could go to the Johnson Library in Texas, or the Kennedy Library in Boston, or the FDR Library in Hyde Park, New York. And so at one level, I enjoyed that and found it satisfying, rewarding to sort of be in the ambience of the places that these presidents had put their libraries, you see. But I think that becomes less so now with the technology that's available. But of course, it takes years, decades, for especially the national security materials to come to hand. Now, of course, also there's millions and millions of pages of material. And something that will be lost is that when you go to these libraries and you have conversations with the archivists who are so much more familiar with the materials than you are, because they've been spending years sorting them and putting them into some kind of order that allows them to be available to researchers. And so I found over the years that conversations with the archivists when I got to the library, because they could point me to things I should look at, as opposed to, because these files, if you go in the Johnson Library and you want to work on civil rights, you know, it's a massive amount of material. And so if you go in the Kennedy Library and want to work on the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's huge. And even Franklin Roosevelt, of course, it's a really quite different era at this point, but still, it's so helpful to be able to have a conversation with the archivist who can help point you to. And they're also happy that you come, but I think the staffs will be sort of more internal now at these libraries, because it's not as if you're going to have a reading room with lots of people coming in, but the requests are going to be online. And so with these recent administrations, it's going to be decades before, because the amount of materials proliferated, it's just so much greater than it ever was before. I don't know how many millions and millions of pages, for example, there are at the Reagan Library, that they're still working to open them, working to open materials at the Nixon Library, see. So it's a challenge. And I always find that if you have students with a keen interest in American politics and the presidency, I love it when, like you, can get out and do research that's, you know, directed.
Professor Dallek, I want to thank you for being with us tonight and for sharing your insights and your wisdom about these times we're living in, and sharing with us the history that you have researched and chronicled so beautifully throughout your career. Again, his most recent book is How Did We Get Here? From Theodore Roosevelt to Donald Trump. It is absolutely worth the read. Normally at this point, people would come up and mob you and ask you to sign the book. And we're sorry that we can't do that today, but We hope that we'll have you up to Newport and to the university in fairly short order. Until then, we wish you well. I want to thank again my great colleague, Bill Leeman. I want to thank the McGinty family, Bill McGinty, for being with us earlier tonight, the Department of History, and all my great colleagues at the university. Thank you for all you do. And thank you to the audience for being with us tonight. We'll see you again down the road. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.